Hello, mystery readers. This is Alexandra Amor, and this is It's a Mystery Podcast. I'm here today with Vered Ehsani. Hi, Vered.
Hi, how are you doing, dear?
I'm good. How are you?
Yeah, good. As I mentioned, we have no electricity right now, but it's not a normal state of affairs. We just don't have electricity whenever it rains, so we're good.
Yeah. Well, it's nice that your Wi-Fi is working anyway.
For a little while, yeah. We'll see how long it lasts.
Yes, yeah. You're the first author I've spoken to in Africa, so this is pretty exciting.
Cool.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to this very much. So let me introduce you to our listeners. So Vered Ehsani has been a writer since she could hold pen to paper, which is a lot longer than she cares to admit. Since mid-2000, she's lived in Kenya with her family and various other animals. When she isn't writing, she pretends to work as an environmental consultant. Her current book series can best be described as Jane Austen meets Lara Croft in colonial Africa. Although she can't claim to be a paranormal detective, Vera does share a lot in common with the series' main character, who refuses to let danger and death inconvenience her. And this series looks like so much fun, and I was so excited to talk to you about it today. So let's start with Beatrice Knight, your main character. So she's a paranormal detective.
Yeah.
It's the late 19th century, and like 1890.
Yeah, 1890. She arrives in Kenya in 1899.
Okay, all right. And she was working as a paranormal detective in London, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay,
Yeah.
so take us on a bit of her journey to find Africa.
So basically, the character is a British woman during the height of colonialism, and of course, as you know, at that time, Kenya, which was called East Africa, was under British rule. So because of some sort of problem in the family, they had to leave England and go to Kenya or East Africa at the time. And she thought that she was retiring from investigating the paranormal, but it turns out that Africa is actually full of paranormal and mythological stories. And I had a lot of fun investigating and researching that. You know, we tend to hear a lot about Egypt mythology. You know, that's quite a common, when people think of Africa, it's usually Egypt mythology. But there's actually a lot of beautiful stories and mythology and fantastic characters when you go south of Egypt, rather, yeah, in sub-Saharan Africa. Right. So that's kind of where my focus has been and what I've been exploring.
And one of your reviewers did mention that there is so much myth and legend and like shape-shifting animals and haunted places and that kind of thing. Are you okay?
Oh yeah, my phone is just ringing off the hook. There we go. Of course, it's been quiet all day, but the moment that we sit down, you know, all heck breaks loose. I have dogs, I have people coming, phones ringing, no electricity. Perfect timing. This is classic.
Yes, yeah, perfect time. Oh, well, it's exciting, right?
Yeah.
Yes, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. So Africa, yeah, lots of legend, myth, you know, demonic possession, haunted places. I mean, it must be, as you just said, rich with those kinds of stories and legends and that kind of thing.
Absolutely. In fact, this whole thing started when I was chatting with a Kenyan friend of mine, and he was telling me how he would go to the village where his family comes from, you know, for holidays and stay with his grandmother. And she would share with him all of these stories from the village, from his culture, from his tribe. And so he started sharing a few of them with me. And I realized, wow, this is amazing stuff. Like, we never hear about these legends. You know, it's always either Egypt or Rome or, you know, something like that Europeans and North and Americans read about. But this stuff is just amazing. It's so rich, and there's so many layers to explore. So that's kind of launched me on my crusade to discover and research about it. And as I began to research, I was like, wow, there's so many great ideas here to explore and to pick apart.
Yes.
And that's kind of what it is in the series.
Exactly, yeah. And so the first book, which we should mention, is free. Ghosts of Tsavo. Is that how you pronounce it?
Exactly.
Tsavo. Pardon me. And I noticed one of your reviewers mentioned that she had heard of the lions of Tsavo, which I looked up and were a whole thing, a couple of man-eating lions. Attacking people building a railway. And so tell us a bit, do they tie in at all to the first book, Ghosts of Tsavo?
Absolutely. In fact, the Ghosts of Tsavo are referred to also as the man-eaters of Tsavo. There was actually a movie done that was quite popular at one point, about 10, 15 years ago, called The Ghost in the Darkness, and it was about these famous lions. And they were real. They haunted or they stalked the workers along the British Railway in East Africa, and Tsavo is actually an area in Kenya. So specifically, these lions were found in Kenya in the late 1800s, and for about a year, they ate or they killed at least 30 people plus, and people were so terrified of these lions because they had developed a habit of eating people, so that's why they're called the man-eaters. So eventually, they were killed. They weren't ghosts, but they were referred to as ghosts because nobody could track them. So people became very superstitious around them because no matter what they tried, these lions always somehow escaped capture until finally one hunter managed to get them. So I kind of started to play with that idea and thought, well, what would happen if these really were ghosts? If it wasn't just very clever lions evading capture? And that began the whole kind of story around the ghosts of Tsavo. So while that is the premise of the first book, it's actually kind of an excuse to also create the world, to introduce some of the paranormal characters that I learned about from different mythology, different tribal stories. And so it sets the platform for the rest of the series, as well as playing around with this idea of the ghosts of Tsavo and what would have happened if they were real.
Okay. Oh, fantastic. And so Beatrice, she's a paranormal detective, and she has a talent for seeing ghosts and smelling them, I noticed, somebody mentioned. Yeah. So in the first book, in the very first scene, she's with a woman she suspects of being a werewolf. Mm-hmm. And she talks about the scent of wet dog fur, essentially. So is that something that runs in her family? How did she acquire these gifts?
Okay, well, that actually is something that is a mystery that is sort of unveiled throughout the series. There's a number of each story has its own big mystery, but then there's also a number of mysteries that kind of get resolved throughout the series. So I'll give you a little hint about Mrs. Knight, because she's very formal, so we refer to her as Mrs. Knight. I never call her Beatrice. I call her Mrs. Knight. So Mrs. Knight has a bit of a history in her family, which she actually denies, because although she's a paranormal investigator and she does have this talent, she also has this prejudice around all things paranormal. So she kind of views paranormal creatures as slightly inferior or something to be watched and to be kind of kept under control. And so this kind of prejudice plays out over the first few books, and she basically gets confronted with this through her family history, which, not a big surprise. She actually has a paranormal sort of strain within her family that she was unaware of, or she denied it, even when she discovered it. So this is part of her character development, that she has to be confronted with her prejudices and then embrace them or do something with them. And so that's one of the lines of the storylines that run through the first 4 books of the series.
Oh, fantastic. I love that. So she's kind of a reluctant paranormal detective, would you say?
Very reluctant. Although at the same time, she values her skills, because unlike a lot of the women of the time, or maybe a lot of them were like this, but they couldn't express it, she doesn't want to be this woman who just stays at home and goes to tea parties the way she sees her aunt and her cousin. And so this skill, which is highly valued in her society, is her ticket out, so to speak. So although she values it and she's grateful for it, she also feels a certain repugnance around it. So these conflicts are there, sort of underlying her development as an individual.
Oh, fantastic. That's fascinating. And I noticed in the bio that I read at the beginning, you said that you share a lot of characteristics with her, with Mrs. Knight. What would you what would you say those are?
Okay, we both love tea.
Okay.
Okay, tea is a serious thing for Mrs. Knight. She doesn't go anywhere without her pot of tea, and she often is horrified when people say, "Oh, there isn't time for tea," or "This isn't the right time for tea," there's this happening. She's horrified. What do you mean? There's always time for tea. It's never not a time for tea. So, and I feel very much the same way. I'm a teetotaler. So that's one thing we have in common. The other is a curiosity about the world. She is She says, imagination and curiosity are the most important tools for an investigator, especially a paranormal investigator. And that's something that I'm very curious about the world. I love to learn. I'm always taking some kind of a course or reading something. So I think that's something that we both share. The other is a sense of adventure. I mean, certainly back in 1899, there's no internet. People didn't know anything about Africa apart from that it was dangerous and the dark continent, and there were savage peoples and tribes, and all these prejudices and fears, and yet she picked herself up and just went. And similarly, I have that sense of adventure. And my husband and I, we arrived in Kenya in 2000. During a time when people were leaving the country because there was no jobs, electricity was even worse than it is now, and there was a lot happening in the country. And yet we just decided, you know what, we're just going to do this. And so I think that those are areas that we're very similar in.
Okay. Yeah. And you mentioned curiosity and what was
imagination?
Imagination, which are the perfect characteristics for a writer, right?
Exactly.
Yes. Yeah. Exactly. And then Mrs. Knight brings with her to Africa the ghost of her deceased husband.
Yeah. He's a bit of a comedic character. He's quite a funny one.
Okay. And does he stay with her throughout the course of the books?
Yes, off and on. He kind of disappears at certain times, but he is one of the main characters. He provides a bit of comic relief. He's always prodding and poking at her, and yet he deeply loves her. But he is, again, there's a sort of this love and antagonistic relationship that they have, because on the one hand she can't imagine her life without him. On the other hand, she says, it's bad enough to haunt your spouse when you're alive, but when you're dead, it's completely poor manners. And he continues to haunt her. So they have this bit of a sort of a tug of a bit of a tug in their relationship, but he is there, and he's a very loyal, if not sort of antagonistic character.
Okay. And the one thing I noticed right away was that you mentioned that she has a fully loaded walking stick. So tell us what that is.
Okay, so Mrs. Knight is not an old character. She's old by British standards. She's in her I think she's 25 when the series opens up. And as her aunt keeps reminding her, for an unmarried woman, okay, she's a widow, but she's old. She's basically past prime at that stage, so there's no hope for her to remarry, and that's it, she's done. And her aunt sort of just despairs of how she will deal in life with this niece of hers. However, so Mrs. Knight is 25, and yet she has this walking stick, and she says it's a perfect weapon because people don't look at it. They kind of think it's it's just a walking stick, so they assume that she's infirm, she has some limp maybe, or so they never look at it. So she said that makes it the perfect weapon. So the loaded walking stick, it has a saber that pops out the end. It has a couple of secret cabinets or drawers that you can pull out different tools. She's very adept at breaking into houses if she needs to, much to some of her relations' horror. But she's, very well prepared. She says, you must be very well prepared if you're going to do this kind of work. So that's her fully loaded walking stick.
Oh, that's fantastic. I wasn't sure if loaded referred to bullets or not, but it's a saber.
No. She doesn't use guns, but she is very good at a bow and arrow and using her blade. So that's her weapon of choice.
Okay, got it. Thanks. And so then she ends up belonging to a society of paranormal people in Kenya. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Sure. So actually, the Society for Paranormals is actually the British agency that she worked for. And so when she comes to Kenya, or to East Africa at the time, she believes that she's done with them, but they still have their hooks on her. Meanwhile, when she comes here, she finds there's a parallel agency or parallel society here that's very much, a lot of the parallels I was making with the British colonials coming to Africa and feeling like, we're bringing civilization. Meanwhile, there's these ancient histories that are here, tribes that have been here for thousands of years, and they have their own civilization. So it's a bit of a clash of civilization that was happening on the paranormal level as well. Mm-hmm. So some of the characters that she meets, like the first character that she meets, her aunt mistakes the man for a porter because they're arriving at the train station in Nairobi, and this big man walks up and immediately Mrs. Knight realizes, okay, this guy, she can see things. So she realizes this guy is a bit different. He's not, he's not your standard porter. But her aunt is insistent that this man is a porter and he must help them carry the trunks. Meanwhile, this man turns out to be a very powerful figure in the local paranormal community. So he is not impressed at all with the whole scene. So there's this whole play that goes on between the three of them as they're trying to decide, who's going to do what, where, and how. So that's one. And then there's a few sort of creatures that she also encounters, apart from the lions. The lions turn out to be shapeshifters, which is not a big surprise. But there's some other interesting creatures that come out. Shapeshifting is actually part of a lot of the African mythology as well. It's not just werewolves from Europe. It's actually shapeshifting is part of some histories that are here in Africa. So yeah, go ahead. Sorry, as I said, I'm trying to coordinate. We have no power, so I'm coordinating our light system as well. In the background, my kids are running back and forth with our portable lanterns. So for example, one of the characters that later gets introduced and later in the series is called a Popobawa. And the Popobawa is a man who can shapeshift into a giant bat. And there's a whole history about how that was created. So it was believed that he was an evil spirit that a chief summoned to punish another chief. But that evil spirit got away from that chief and became its own creature and then caused havoc amongst everyone. So again, this is a part of the sort of the coastal mythology. So I kind of, again, took that and played with it a little bit and then created this amazing, wonderful character. I love this character, actually. And, again, some of these characters, you're not sure, are they bad, are they good, are they, where is their loyalty? But I think that's true to human nature. We're not all bad or all good. We all have these elements within us. So I always try to, with most of the characters, not make any of them out to be, saints or sinners, but rather this natural mix in between. And so that kind of makes it a bit fun that you're not really sure where people's loyalties are and what they're going to do next.
Yeah, I think that does make it really fun and really fun for the reader, to have that little bit of uncertainty. Do you find sometimes you get lost in the research? Like, do you kind of go down the rabbit hole a little bit?
Definitely, absolutely. In fact, I a few months ago, I got this fantastic book that was printed in Kenya, and it was about Nairobi in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and it's a very different city now, of course. But so I just got lost in these old photos, these beautiful, beautiful photos, and some of the characters that lived in Nairobi at that time, and then thinking, how can they play into my stories, and just a lot of fun stuff like that. So yeah, there's a lot more scope. I haven't researched everything yet, but at some point you have to kind of pull back and say, okay, I have enough. Let me go on the next journey, and we can come back to the research.
Yes, yeah. Exactly, right. One thing I noticed, I read the first couple of chapters of The Ghosts of Tsavo, and Mrs. Knight's the voice of the book is so strong. Like she's such a quirky character, and I felt like in the first chapter I just dived right into the story, and within a few paragraphs I felt like I had a sense of who she was. So as a writer, I'm curious, did it take you a while to find that voice, or did she show up right away? What was that like for you?
Okay, so let me tell you where my inspiration for the voice came from.
Okay.
It's Pride and Prejudice is a classic, okay, and I've read that book a number of times. So I was actually reading that book when I was writing, and I purposely was channeling my inner Jane Austen when I was writing, because Mrs. Knight comes from that era. I mean, she comes from the same period of time as Jane Austen, and the first book, actually, The Ghosts of Tsavo, is a bit of, if you know Pride and Prejudice really well, you'll actually find that there's a certain, it's a bit of a spoof of Pride and Prejudice. So there's certain elements, like Mrs. Knight's aunt is very much like, the mother of the girls, sort of like the on again, off again relationships that they have with some of the men that they meet, some of them being paranormal, some not. That plays out in the first few books. So I very much was kind of taking Pride and Prejudice and having fun with it as well, incorporating some elements into it that people are familiar with. And that also includes the language. So if you look at the way I've written it, it's completely the opposite of what some people say you should do as a writer. So people say, oh, don't use a lot of adjectives and adverbs and, be very sparse in your language. Well, the language I use is over the top. It's just flowery and full of adjectives and adverbs and descriptions and very much Pride and Prejudice style. Mm-hmm. And that was done on purpose, because when I was thinking of Mrs. Knight, her voice, to me, the Pride and Prejudice, the way that book and other books of Jane Austen are written, that style resonates with who Mrs. Knight is. She's very formal and very proper, and yet at the same time, there's this humor that comes out that some of it's a bit sly and very dry, and you have to almost watch for it because it just comes out. And just like with Pride and Prejudice, the humor isn't like hit you over the head. It's more like, wait a minute, was she making a sarcastic comment there? So it's that kind of an approach.
Right. Okay. And I could see how that her being sort of buttoned up and proper and of that era would really conflict with, as we talked about earlier, this talent that she has for paranormal detecting. And so that push and pull in those two parts of her character must provide for a lot of interesting situations and conflict within herself. It's great to have a conflicted main character.
Completely. And it's also has a lot of opportunity for some humor, because on the one hand, she recognizes this conflict, and sometimes she says, oh, to hell with it, I'm just going to go anyways, So there are moments when she just realizes, okay, it's either give up my properness or die in the process. So, okay, I'm planning on living, so let me just get on with doing what I need to do. So there is a lot of kind of play on those various levels of tension between the colonial versus the tribal people of East Africa, between what's proper and expected of a lady and what an investigator needs to do to survive, between different expectations of different characters, and then also prejudices that a number of the characters have at different levels. And while Mrs. Knight, interestingly enough, doesn't have a prejudice about the African people around her the way some of the British colonialists did, she has other prejudices that come out that are just as strong.
Oh, fantastic. And does she, just one last question, does she live alone, or does she live with her aunt?
She lives with her aunt and her aunt's family. So she actually, because she's a widow, she doesn't have any real means to support herself. And women at that age, in that era, would either have to be living with their family or their husband or someone looking after them, or be independently wealthy, like marry a rich man and kill him off and then be independently wealthy widow. So she wasn't any of those things. She was a widow, but she was not wealthy. So she went back to live with her aunt and uncle and her niece and her cousins. Okay,
got it. Yeah. Well, this has been amazing, and thank you so much for being such a trooper with all your electrical problems and guests arriving and everything else. I really appreciate it.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
And so why don't you tell everyone where they can find your books?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I sell them on all the major platforms, but if you want to find links to where they are, it's Vered Ehsani, so VeredEhsani.co.za. So that's my website. Okay. But my books can be found on Amazon and Kobo and Smashwords and Barnes and Nobles and iBooks. If you go to my website, I do offer 3 books, the first book and 2 novellas for free, so you can get those there. And I'm actually launching the 5th book, and in celebration of the 5th book, I'm really excited about this actually. I created this photo journal of Nairobi in 1900. So it kind of gives readers a bit of a tour of Nairobi, what it was like, what it really looked like, to kind of add to what they picked up from the book. And included in the photo journal is descriptions about the photos, including some of the characters who I include in my novels. So some of my characters are historical characters. And then there's also some odd, quirky quotes from Mrs. Knight herself, because, she's got a lot of great quotes that I love very much. So that photo journal I'm going to be making available to any subscriber very shortly. But right now it's available to anyone who subscribes. I'm launching the photo journal on the 5th of May, sort of in preparation for my big book launch on the 10th of May. But after that, I'll be making the photo journal available as well to subscribers.
Oh, perfect. Okay, so I'll put some links and mention of that in the show notes as well. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Vered. I really appreciate it.
Okay. Absolutely. Thank you for having me on the show. Thanks so much.
You're welcome. Bye.
Yes, bye.